You are currently in workshop number 4, Electoral Politics as Harm Reduction. This workshop series is a collaboration between Make Yourself Useful and ACRE, both in Chicago. Make Yourself Useful is a small collective focused on anti-racist work with an emphasis on the active role of white people and people with white privilege within movements for racial and social justice. ACRE stands for Artists, Cooperative, Residency, and Exhibitions, and is perhaps best known for a yearly summer residency for artists in Steuben, Wisconsin.
I like that we're introducing Make Yourself Useful as a collective. ACRE is a tiny nonprofit. All of our work here is voluntary and unpaid. We are not experts, but have experimented, fucked up, studied, and occasionally done a few things right. NYU and ACRE are scrappy and conversational versus institutional and academic. Neither of these things are better than the other, but we do not speak with authority on these matters, and we think it's important to own that outright. We are here tonight to humbly share our knowledge, what we have learned over the last 6+ years of engaging both formally and informally in the movement for Black lives. We come from an ethic that believes in the urgency of racial justice work, that leadership in those movements is most effective when held by those most affected, and that those who benefit from inherited unjust systems like racism have a moral and spiritual duty to act in opposition. This workshop is designed to give you some tactical strategies to effectively support Black-led movements for liberation. In this effort, we hope to also empower all of us to better act on our values of justice and liberation for all. Cool. So I guess this is me now. So I'm Kate Bowen, and I'm going to be I'm excited to lead this discussion tonight. I am the director of ACRE. I'm also an artist and an educator based in Chicago. In addition to like my work in the arts, I work in the context of community organizing, in particular over the last 6 years with Pilsen Alliance, which is a grassroots leadership organization, or it's an organization based in Pilsen that's devoted to raising grassroots leadership on Chicago's south and near west side. I've worked on issues campaigns, I've worked on political campaigns, and I've worked with organizations working toward community self-determination. I've stood outside of a lot of polling places. I've done a lot of canvassing. I've knocked a lot of doors. I've pushed a lot of signs into yards. So I'm like excited to sort of talk about some of those experiences and how I've been involved. And helping me tonight are going to be Linnea and Ruby. So I let them introduce themselves.
Hello. If you were here last week, you know me. I've been involved with NYU for about 3 years. My name is Linnea Dominic. I was a union organizer for 4 years with Unite Here, and currently work in radio. Also have done a lot of canvassing for various political campaigns throughout the years.
Ruby?
Hi, I'm Ruby. I am an artist and an arts educator, and I've worked with Make Yourself Useful since 2016. Prior to that, I've done a lot of different kinds of organizing work, a lot of it based around community-based art. And for a long time, I was part of the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network in the Chicago chapter. And so my organizing work has looked really different at really different times, and I'm really happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so welcome to Electoral Politics as Harm Reduction. So this, like all of the topics that we've done in this workshop series, is really big, is huge, and likely can't be contained in the 90 minutes that we have together. So that's just to say, like, to sort of set the intentions that there's like lots of things that we're going to introduce tonight that we hope that you'll also like explore further on your own. We are going to discuss voting myths, what harm reduction truly means, movement organizing and supporting community organizers, how to find your candidates, PACs, and understanding how that, like, kind of some of that money works, writing scripts and calling your reps, and tools for finding information and doing your homework. We'll end tonight practicing calling and leaving action-oriented messages for our representatives around, which we'll talk about later. So can I have the next slide? So tonight's tip jar is going to be a pick your fund, a choose your own, if you will, own adventure. So if you have the next slide. The Movement Voter Project is an organization working to connect donors to grassroots movement organizations, working directly with their communities to grow their power and create transformation from policy to the streets. So we have a link in the chat box, or I will put one in the chat box. If you care to check them out, there's actually might be one particular fund. So you can take a look at their website. As an organization, they're supporting a lot of, they sort of lift up a lot of different organizations in different states and regions and districts. So you can kind of like take a look and decide which you'd like to give your tip to. I think you could also like particularly look for some of those areas that have contested races coming up or are in positions in need to make some of that change. Okay, so tonight we're going to start with a couple of quotes to help us settle in. And I'm going to just, actually these are kind of long, so I'm going to let us sort of take a look at those, but I'm going to highlight a couple of sections from these quotes. In particular, this: historically, in relationship to elections, white solidarity with Black folks has looked like Black voter enfranchisement and white people making space for Black people historically to be able to vote. And then a lot of white actions leading towards there being more space for Black people to organize on a national level. And how do we make sure that there is still space for Black folks to fight for liberation? And what does it look like, kind of given what can be a significant change in the politics of the United States with this election, and then also bringing that thinking to a local level. And so what I want to like highlight from this quote from Robbie Clark of Black Lives Matter in Oakland is, you know, the ideas that I think he's expressing or that they're expressing is like, what is political power and how do we gather it? Some of the things I think we're going to be thinking about tonight. Political power, just as a sort of basic definition, is the ability to control and or influence the outcome of events. Influence, I think, being a really operative word here. Political power enables people or groups to control the policies, functions, and the culture of society. So dismantling and replacing the system is going to take a lot of work. It won't happen overnight. I think about the phrase death by 1,000 paper cuts a lot when I think about organizing. It needs many points of contact and sustained engagement over time, and it kind of needs all of us in lots of ways. I also wanted to mention that what we've talked about in our past workshops, if you've been with us before, feels like they come home in this one. This is co-conspirator work, truly, and it requires that you do your homework and you follow up. It's a lot about following Black and Brown leaders and strategically holding space with them. It's about being able to understand the message and talk to folks who don't necessarily agree with you and don't necessarily want to talk to you. And those people aren't just your family, those are often strangers, which can be really fun also. It's also about accountability and ongoing engagement, lasting engagement. And we want to be asking ourselves again, like, how can we be co-conspirators to organize with social movements like the Movement for Black Liberation, to think about how we're participating, as this quote expresses, like how we're participating so that we're making room, that we're using our sort of our privilege to create space to support Black people having the opportunity and the power to change the rules. How do we support political power and the enfranchisement of those most often marginalized by mainstream politics? So some things that I think are also important things for us to think about in terms of like grounding ourselves in what we're going to talk about tonight are, you know, who is your candidate, your organization, the issue that you're interested in, surrounded by? Are you in good company? Are there many voices from inside an issue being represented? Are the white people always talking? Are the cis men always talking? Are people looking to share power? And do those in power understand that they hold and wield power? And I think there's like probably plenty of examples and probably plenty in this room or in this Zoom from moments when we've maybe been out organizing and we've been with people who don't understand how they hold and wield power. And so like, I think these are things we should be asking ourselves anytime we're getting involved in political movements or in organizing, because we want to make sure that our values go kind of all the way down and all the way up. And the last thing I want to say on the sort of grounding note is that like politics is a hot topic, like and it's hot in general. We find a lot of passionate and engaged people inside of political and community organizing. I think that something remains really important is how to make more space, again, to be supportive and to show up in service of that movement. So that's another sort of way I want to kind of like ground us today. So come to the next slide. This is a quote from Cornel West. In a democracy, who's quoting Aristotle, the democracy, the poor will have more power than the rich because there are more of them, and the will of the majority is supreme. So I think that's sort of like our ideal situation, right? Is that the majority is a powerful majority that is most affected by the rule. But I think we also need to like take this and be thinking about the challenges to this kind of to our democracy, right? There's a history of voter suppression in this country in particular. It's sort of our next favorite pastime, and you know, we live in a country with majority rule because of the Electoral College, because of gerrymandering, because of historical voter disenfranchisement and active voter disenfranchisement. So we have a small group of white men who make choices on our behalf. It's important to remember that there has been a concerted effort to control who gets to vote in this democracy, and that it has been even more effort to deny folks the right to vote, especially Black people, and both parties have used their power to suppress voter rights. And the next slide. So, you know, there's a lot of like ways in which like electoral politics as harm reduction sort of works as a framework, which we'll kind of talk about, but also that this is a complicated context to sort of bring to the table. So I want to make a few notes on this idea of how we're bringing harm reduction as a frame. Harm reduction as a term and concept comes most readily to us from the Harm Reduction Coalition. It's an organization, this is like kind of an exact definition in this slide, from this is an organization that advocates for the health and human rights of drug users, prioritizing non-punitive methods and holistic approaches. So harm reduction has some key points with abolition in that they are both frameworks that prioritize preventing harm over punishing those who harm. So we're taking this from a 2012 pamphlet titled, What is Abolition? And in that pamphlet, Critical Resistance writes, we believe in order to reduce harm, we must change the social and economic conditions in which those harms take place. More recently, harm reduction has been used as a term with slightly different meanings in the leftist political sphere to describe what it means to engage in electoral politics. The idea that elections do not fix problems, nor do they heal all wounds, but that they do matter. Harm reduction implies that harm will still happen, that the work is unfinished. This is a crucial framework for approaching movements for social justice holistically. So we're too borrowing somewhat uncomfortably the term harm reduction because it ties to empathy and abolition, which are powerful tools for grounding the work ahead. Harm reduction is also a set of strategies that employ flexibility in its approach to outcomes. And one piece of that strategy that I want to also like lift up before we go to our next quote, actually we can pull that next quote up, is that like harm reduction does not attempt to minimize or ignore the real and tragic harm and danger associated with illicit and illicit drug use. And so like neither does our framing of using this. I think that's an important thing to remember. So it is necessary to, this is a quote from Brittany Lee Frederick, and we'll see another part of this quote later from the Black Youth Project. It's necessary to draw attention to the rising tide of violence being levied against marginalized folks, but particularly Black ones, as we increase participation in electoral politics. Democrats are lying to you, promising voting will fix this mess we're in. Okay, let's go to our next one. So just to kind of like lean into some of that and like flesh some of this out, let's talk about some harmful voting or narratives around voting. I think that every time we see an election cycle come out, we'll also see a lot of people sort of suggesting that this is the best way to have your voice heard, or that this is true protest. And I think these are like, you know, oversimplification and maybe like misrepresent some of these realities. There's 32 million adults who cannot vote in presidential elections. 1 in 10 people 18 years and older cannot legally vote. Felony disenfranchisement in particular disproportionately impacts the people of color and Black Americans. And it's just important to be, and then, and on and on. It is important to be cognizant of the many critiques of the role of electoral politics play in keeping Black folks from getting free. And also that the reasons that people abstain from voting can be totally legitimate and are like historically informed. We could go to the next slide. This is like a final quote from the Black Youth Project article from Brittany Leanne Frederick, just to highlight kind of like few, if any, Democrats have encouraged Black and other marginalized people to be careful when heading to the polls, to go with a friend if they can, to have committed in any way on the commented in any way on the risks that are waiting for us. Their silence on these practical problems only betrays the reality that we are not much more than votes for them, and to ignore as for them to ignore as soon as it becomes inconvenient. So I think those are just some of the things to really like think about when we're talking about electoral politics. And I think we'll also be kind of in this workshop talking a lot about community organizing and movement organizing work as a way of supporting gaining political power that isn't just voting. And so we wanted to bring that kind of to the table. So on the other hand, if I can have the next quote here, next one. So this is from Roxane Gay, an article from Roxane Gay, but I want to also, I'll let you guys read that. I think the big important thing is about here, sort of do something, do anything. There's lots of ways to support candidates. There's lots of ways to get in here. I also wanted to lift up this quote from Rosemary Ketchum, who is the newly elected city council member and the first openly trans elected official in West Virginia, who won recently. And I was listening to an interview with her, and she said, it's far more efficient to replace our elected officials than to convince them. And it's actually a little bit more fun. So, and then also, again, like, Minneapolis is about to vote on a referendum to dissolve the police department. So this, all of these things in balance, like voices and voters and constituencies, like do really matter and can be really powerful when we do that work, when we lift up our voices together. So with all of that in mind, I'm gonna go to the next slide. So, so selecting your candidates, I think that some things that are really important and are gonna be kind of important throughout this entire presentation is the idea about knowing who you're supporting and doing your homework. Having conversations with people and kind of like being curious and looking thoroughly. Understanding politics as a whole picture can be really important. I think you want to have your eyes and your ears open, and then look at the folks that are supporting your candidate. Are you in good company? Like, are there many voices inside of a candidate's campaign? I was working for Byron Sigcho's campaign, who was the alderman of the 25th Ward, and I stood outside of polling places, both on all of the elections, there would be on one corner, lots of women, a big sort of diverse crowd of people, young people, old people, like all, sort of differently able, we're all kinds of bodies and people. And on sort of our like opponents end, it was like the same group of 35-year-old men, they'll really tell you something about like what's actually like sort of going on. Like just kind of looking around will tell you a lot about who you're with, and what they're for. So you want to, I think another way, so like there's some really great resources in this slide, looking at Common Cause. You can find information through these resources. Ballot Ready and Ballotopia are both places where you can see encyclopedic information about American politics and elections, and find out what's on your ballot, including referendums and other things that often don't come to the surface because like people love to sneak that stuff through. So, and then, like looking in your community for voter guides, there's a lot of really great voter guides out there. Girl, I Guess is in Chicago, and they've put together a really great voting guide the last few years. Make Yourself Useful also has a voter guide. And then we also put up here Too Evil endorsements from LA. It's a really like wonderfully designed voting guide. And if you have any that you'd like to share, please put them in the chat so that we can add them to our resources, or take a look at the organizers in wherever you all may be that are kind of putting together these voter guides, or if you're putting together one yourself. I think like a lot of things, like, you know, that takes a lot of like research and time. So, you know, if someone's putting together a voter guide, you might want to lean into like helping them. You know, this is going to also be a workshop a lot about like joining in and not necessarily like starting your own thing, as the politics is kind of about. The other thing I wanted to say about finding your officials and candidates is like looking at campaign organizers can be a really interesting way of understanding who your candidate is and who you might want to support. Christian Woods is a organizer who worked for Kim Fox, who helped Kim Fox get elected, and then went on to work with Fritz Kagi, who is our Cook County assessor now, who we kind of like overthrew a 30-year-old installed Chicago machine Cook County assessor, right? And I think this is an organizer that I admire a lot, and I think, you know, I would kind of like, I like who she sort of supports, and I tend to sort of like look at who she might be, you know, like supporting with her time and energy. Yeah, so then our next slide. And then here's this other thing, which is like, don't forget about the judges. I think this is sort of, I think every time I go to the polls, at least, this is also always the one I sort of forget until the last minute. I think it's like not necessarily always the sexiest thing that comes up. We don't have a lot of like judges campaigning until they're in contested elections. Thinking about reading between the lines, looking at who, you know, like follow that money, looking at who is supporting these candidates, what the judges' sort of background and history is, who's endorsing them. Injustice Watch is a really great resource. The Chicago Bar Association, I put some asterisks there because the Chicago Bar Association's role is to really tell you whether they've kind of done their job or not. They're not maybe like looking for the same things that like something like Injustice Watch is looking for. And then I like to just like look at who the Fraternal Order of Police is endorsing, and then just like not support that candidate. I think that that is also like a not necessarily always like a perfect thing there, but like the Fraternal Order of Police is in my like a highly problematic like sort of entity in Chicago. And then again, like sharing resources and discussing with others, like help each other like figure out you know, like start talking about these things, because we can't have any more like fat caviar eating money collecting cat judges in the world. So yeah, so on that sort of note about like reading between the lines and following the material and thinking about who's getting what from whom, I'm going to kind of turn it over to Ruby and Linnea to talk about our next slide.
So this headline was in the Times today because New York just had their primary and the results are still coming in, but just an exciting moment. Like, New York is just becoming more and more progressive, and it's looking really good for a lot of like very left-leaning young candidates of color. And so this is Mondaire Jones, and it looks like he's going to it looks like he's leading in his race. And I always, you know, I always look and see like who the squad is endorsing. That's like one way to, especially at the national level, to see like, okay, did they endorse this like in the last primary, did they endorse the person in Illinois who I was leaning towards? Like, oh, AOC's got them, okay, they're good in my book. That's like pretty easy. But there's also, you know, there's these organizations up on the screen: Working Families Party, Sunrise Movement, Indivisible, Justice Democrats. They all endorse, and I think that it's a starting point, and there's still more research and more work to do when you're trying to figure out who you're going for. But having like at least 8 sources to kind of balance out who you're looking at that's at least how I try to go. And all of these organizations, in addition to doing endorsements, have like really good issue-based toolkits and a lot of scripts for calling representatives. So I highly recommend checking out checking all of these websites out, not just during election time, but also if you're like looking for an electoral engagement with like any kind of racial justice, etc. issue that's coming up. And I think that's it for that slide. I'll put all of those links in the chat.
So one of the things I think is also important is to, for me, I know with elections, a lot of terms get thrown around that I just feel like I should know what they are, but they go over my head. And so I feel like PACs are one of those, and they actually have a huge reach and impact on elections. So I just wanted to ground in what they are. So political action committees are political committees. They're established and administered by corporations, labor unions, membership organizations, trade associations. So some organizations that we're into and some that we're not. They can spend limited amounts of money on parties or candidates. The maximum is $5,000 a year. PACs and super PACs advocate for the election or defeat of candidates by purchasing advertisements in all sorts of media.
And in 2010, in speechnow.org versus Federal Election Commission, I think that's the first time I've heard of a website being on one side of the versus. That's really, okay. A federal court found restrictions on individual contributions to independent organizations that seek to influence elections to be unconstitutional. And in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, the US Supreme Court decided that limits on corporate and union spending to influence elections were also unconstitutional. Thus, the super PACs were born. So the super PACs became people.
Critics say the rulings allow wealthy corporations and unions to have an unfair advantage in electing candidates to federal office. And we may have seen that once or twice.
Super PACs are not as regulated as PACs and allow anyone to raise and donate any amount to parties or candidates, according to the FEC. Super PACs cannot spend money in concert or cooperation with or at the request or suggestion of a candidate, the candidate's campaign, or a political party.
Next slide. So there's this organization called the Federal Election Commission, and they are supposed to keep PACs in check. They look at the financing of campaigns for the Senate, presidency, House, vice presidency, and they have three broad subjects that are under their purview: the public disclosure of funds that are raised and spent to influence federal elections, restrictions on contributions and expenditures, and the public financing of presidential campaigns. And there has been some drama in the FEC recently. Next slide. And mostly is that they haven't had enough people on staff to make quorum to be able to meet. So since fall of 2019, the FEC hasn't been able to conduct audits or to find PACs or to vote on the outcome of investigations, because in 2019, in August, Vice Chairman Peterson resigned. So this is huge. We're in the middle of this huge presidential election. Trump was accused of having dealings that were suspicious with foreign governments, and the FEC can't weigh in because they don't have quorum. They have to have 4 out of 6 seats that need to be filled for them to do their jobs. So there was some mixed news in May. Trey Traynor, who Trump had nominated, he had nominated him several times, and he hadn't made it through Senate because he supports minimal campaign finance reform. However, he was approved to be the 4th member of the FEC. So it seemed like the FEC was going to be able to continue doing their jobs. But just a couple of days ago, Caroline Hunter, who is a Republican FEC commissioner, resigned. So they're back to 3 out of 6. Just a couple of days ago as well, Trump nominated Alan Dickerson, but Senate has to vote on the nomination. So when Hunter steps down, the FEC will again have their hands tied and not be able to weigh in on violations of campaign finance. There is a backlog of cases, according to Politico, As of the end of the first quarter, there were 333 pending cases that were unaddressed. So this could take years to sort through. And again, it's a big deal. We're in a presidential election and election for the House and Senate. And so this is just something to be aware of.
Okay, so I think you know, like from the sort of like those are sort of like really at a national level, although like you also can start your own pack like in your own communities, or like there's packs that are small that also work in different kind of ways inside of like cities and districts. You want to get into that, but this is also just to kind of, I think, point out like how dense a lot of this stuff can be. I like to really, I guess I've sort of felt like where things really feel useful for me is like on in the sort of like grassroots level, or in down ballot races, in small campaigns, and in like organizing movements. So we're going to sort of step into policy platforms, movement organizing. So just to kind of define what that sort of means, I think we're talking about the movement a lot lately, because we're in an uprising that's, you know, great, but well, and tough, and also, yeah. So movement organizing, or social movement organization, is a specific social movement usually comprised of many social movement organizations, formal organizations that share a movement's goals. So there's like many organizations that have coordinating roles in a social movement. Again, this idea of like, you know, death by 1,000 paper cuts, or like a lot of different sort of points of engagement, a lot of different kinds of like needs. We need funds, we need organizing, we need all these sort of different ways to sort of touch and move our communities. Social movement organizations, you know, do what's sort of necessary and carry out the sort of tactics and strategies for any social movement to survive and be successful. So policy platforms, again, this is kind of like a really another like basic definition, or like dictionary kind of definition, but a policy platform is a document that outlines the community's top priorities, and can be used as a document to approach government representatives and request to fix key problem areas. I think what often a policy platform gets used inside of movement organizing is in service of helping get you know, many sort of movement organizations on the same page, share messaging, set sort of vision for where we want to head, and how we will be like sort of strategically approaching legislation and issues like facing our communities. This is it's really important, as always, to like sort of look at any given policy platform and like think about how it was created. Was it created with community input? Does it credit its contributors? Does it speak to its process? I've been involved in a couple of different policy platform making exercises with the 25th Ward Independent Political Organization, and another independent political organization, and Pilsen Alliance. And, you know, when you have community input, they are slow processes. They take a long time. They're, you know, and that can be really like meaningful. That they should be things that like many people are engaged in making. I think it's like pushing something forward and being kind of in conversation with your community, or the community that you are working with, or the community cause you're working with. So, okay, so being organized means having demands, and this is all sort of like being organized means having demands and understanding the demands of the issues that you support. Most movement-based organizations and grassroots organizations have a policy platform, and that platform shifts and changes with time and the movement. They're valuable guides that drive our priorities and help give directions. And as I sort of prefer kind of issues over candidates, coalitions and political organizing over politicians, this is something that I think I've spent some time thinking about. So I go to the next slide. I think that so I wanted to sort of put forward, and I hopefully we've like looked at this in our lives, but I thought it would be maybe interesting to pull up like the Movement for Black Lives current 2020 policy platform, which they released on Juneteenth, and is like also still in process of being made. So the Movement for Black Lives is, you know, kind of a national and transnational organization inside the movement, or like for the movement, or the sort of the movement for Black liberation. This is, and I think we've like, you know, we've got our, we've posted things on Instagram, we've done this sort of stuff, but like, I guess I wonder if like any of us have actually like read that policy platform or like seen it. And I actually hadn't seen it until I read it. I mean, I'd read this 2016 policy platform, but, you know, I think we want to support things, but also policy platforms can give us a lot of powerful tools to be in support of a movement. They're, you know, they're thoroughly thought through. They are like message based, and they'll give you a lot of like tools and resources for like doing the work, or like figuring out where you want to put your energy and time in support of a community organization or movement organizer on the ground. So, okay, so go to the next slide. So like the Movement for Black Lives has a really like a number of really beautiful documents. It's a really large organization. It's meant to fuel a lot of smaller organizations with its policy platform, and it offers a lot of like action-oriented things to sort of like things to act on. So, and it also shows you like, will show you like key federal and state and local legislation that you can put your energy behind in support of what of this policy platform. So go ahead and go to the next slide. And then the other thing is like they also, like Movement for Black Lives also supplies a lot of toolkits. I mean, this is like a big organization that's very comprehensive. But I think what's fun about like getting into some of these toolkits, especially when we're kind of in this moment thinking about and working toward Black liberation, is that like there are yeah, like again, specific examples or specific policy sample legislation. The argument for each piece of their policy platform includes that argument clearly defined and laid out, vocabulary and key terms, discussion questions that could be taken into trainings and educational settings. There's a lot of like resources put together and a lot of time and energy, and they're really, really good at, they really have a very inclusive platform. And if you haven't like read through it, I encourage you to do so. It's an incredibly effective, effectively written platform, and you know, like the more people that sort of have these tools, the more we're able to sort of like continue to fuel resolution. Understanding the message can be even just like a big part of the thing. Yeah, so one thing we can do, especially those of us who are enfranchised to vote, is to read and understand these platforms and to look for candidates that respond to these demands, as it is all very clearly like laid out for us and in front of us. So then to go to the next slide, you know, there are also like a couple of other things I wanted to pull up here. This is Black Futures Lab, the Black Census, and the Black to the Future Fund, Action Fund. Black Futures Lab is Alicia Garza's organization. It transforms Black communities into constituencies and to change the way that power operates locally, statewide, and nationally. The problems facing our communities are complex. The solutions require experimentation, innovation, and political power. We deserve elected officials that represent us, policies that improve our lives, and politics that reflect our lives. So these are things that also the Black Futures Lab created a Black Census that came out in 2019, that then informed the Black Agenda 2020, and then is backed by the Black to Future Action Fund, which is, I mean, we can get into this like some other time, but it's like a 501c4, which is essentially like a nonprofit organization that can take in money. It's like in politics or in service of, I mean, it's more complicated than that, but we'll just go with that. So yeah, just to say that there's like there's lots of ways that these are that people are coming at the sort of national level at sharing this information, at creating policy platforms, at like attacking legislation and like getting information out, and like fueling the movement with you know, fueling the movement and helping build political power. So I think we can also like look at some of those things when we want to get into things. I think that, you know, we should be prepared to sort of like sign up for a lot of things and to keep showing up. We're sort of we're sort of looking for those opportunities when we're looking at things like this. I wanted to go to like a local example for the next slide of a policy platform. So this is the Chicago Housing Initiative, which is a coalition working toward fair housing and fair housing issues and like housing as a human right as a part of their mission. The Chicago Housing Initiative is a Chicago-based organization. It's a progressive organization with a policy platform and this is actually like a proposal for the Homes for All, like an ordinance. So the Homes for All ordinance. And inside of that, like I think one other thing to look at is that SHI has, you know, it's crediting its like coalition members. It's got people signing on to that. That's another way of like on a sort of, again, like on a local level, like building this kind of political power is to be like, here's all of us saying we're like behind this thing, and we bring with us our constituencies, and our constituencies like, you know, have demands. One of the other things inside of this slide is like, you know, with their policy platform, they also show you who the politicians are that have signed on to that thing. So if your alderman isn't on, you know, you can also use this to look for who you're going to support or how you're going to push or who you're going to call or where you're going to show up. That's another way of kind of like, you know, creating these sort of accountability measures, demanding sort of, or gathering political power and making demands of like officials and of our like, you know, the bureaucracies that are around us. And then the next piece of that is, so yeah, like all of these things are building political power. You know, I think that one other thing to sort of think about is like signing up and showing up. I think you should really like, in terms of like how to get engaged in movement organizing or in support of movement organizers or in support of organizations that are doing this work, I think you should be prepared to like sign up for things and then show up for things. I spend a lot of time like signing up and showing up and just like repeatedly showing up and just like waiting and seeing where I can be sort of like most like useful and continuing to sort of share skills or you know, it's not always about coming in and being prepared to be inside of a decision-making meeting. You got to keep showing up and building trust so that you can kind of get to the place where you have the opportunity to maybe do like larger work. I think it's really important to take that kind of seriously. Sometimes you're going to take the garbage out for a while, or you're going to be supporting things where like organizers really need you. It's about like, you know, standing behind others who like, you know, like standing behind others and like supporting with all of the kinds of like, you know, weird little jobs that we need to have done when we're trying to, you know, get something done. I think that being really honest also about who, like where you're at and what you have like available and what's possible for you and what your time is, like, you know, you don't need to waste organizers like sort of time. You can be like, I have 1 hour a week, what can I do? You know, like I think that's also like being really honest can be really helpful. I think that the other thing to sort of point out is, you know, that you may look at like, so in terms of Chicago Housing Initiative, this sort of has this like coalition and it has its like website. But like if you went to go look at like, you know, Pilsen Alliance's website, thinking about, you know, like the center of some of this organizing work may not be like the flashy website or like, you know, the Movement for Black Lives has like beautiful toolkits, right? And that's a different, you know, like that's an organization operating at a different like level. They're at a national sort of on a national stage, doing national work. On a really local level, a lot of times it might be hard to sort of find that information on the web or like, you know, in the sort of usual way. It might take you showing up in different ways. You also might think about, you know, like if something like that like really bothers you or you're having a hard time finding, like reaching out and like offering some of those skills maybe to folks that might need it. And also being comfortable with that not being something that people want from you when they want you to just take out the garbage or just like, or canvas or knock doors or whatever the thing is. But yeah, like I think thinking about, you know, like who we're working for. So for Pilsen Alliance, it's a lot of like There's a lot of like working class immigrant undocumented folks inside of like the 25th ward, inside of the neighborhood of Pilsen. That's not necessarily a group of people like using a website regularly. So the work doesn't happen out like front all of the time. And that is another reason to sort of, I think, like go hyper local, or like look for the things that are happening, state, city, neighborhood, on your street. So that's things. Yeah, so truly one of the most effective ways to get involved in politics is to volunteer. This is my point. And everybody sort of counts. This is also a really great way, like SHI is a really great way to sort of get involved and to stay involved in a local organization. That is like a really good way to also call for accountability from your like local representatives. Like I go to work for Pilsen Alliance, and Pilsen Alliance's job is to hold accountable like our aldermen and our city and state officials. So it's like, even if we just worked on Byron's campaign, we're like right back into like doing the work to build political power to hold that person accountable, so we don't ever have another Dan Solis. Sign on to sort of policy platforms and make those endorsements and help build that political power. And that also means that people need to keep their promises to you. Okay, so sorry, that's a babble, maybe. That's useful. And we can answer questions and stuff if people have that, and I'm sure you all have some of your own experiences to share. But I'm going to turn it over to Ruby on like writing scripts.
Hi, Linnea, was this yours or mine?
Maybe Gwyneth.
We had somebody have a power outage at the last minute, so we've reshuffled. But
go for it.
Maybe we can share it.
Yeah, so one of the things that has come up in with friends and doing thinking about the most effective ways of reaching representatives, people have been like, well, can I call someone who I'm not a constituent of? And from what I've gathered and heard from different organizers, and we've all been seeing nationally, is that we still have a role in participating and putting pressure on campaigns, even if we're not a constituent. And so it's like flooding action, people from across the country calling people in Aurora to take account and to make sure that police officers are charged and fired, and people in Kentucky. So even if you're not in those places, we still have a role in reaching them and sharing our message.
And then it's always a good idea to look beyond, kind of like Kate mentioned, there's like these really large national organizations all the way down to like very like small, not necessarily super official campaigns that are just as important, often like organized by friends and family of people who are most affected by whatever given issue you're looking at. And so definitely take your time and do research, see what scripts and campaigns are already out there, and look for ways to like support campaigns that are already existing at whatever level. And along with that, something I've been seeing a lot more of lately is like the idea that modifying or even writing your own email, for example, to an elected official is a really good way to like kind of ensure against, or at least somewhat, that you don't just like go to a spam, that your email or your whatever communication doesn't just get routed to like a spam folder. Same goes for like snail mail. Like the weirder your mail looks, the more likely that it's going to get read. So that's why it's great to like comb through what's out there, but maybe not necessarily just like use that boilerplate email. And then when it comes to actually writing a script and trying to kind of like define for yourself what it is you want to say, It's always good to talk about where you're coming from. And it's really good to spend some time figuring out for yourself, like, why this issue is important to you, why you care, and then really pinpointing like the specifics of the legislation that you want them to do. And often that part of it is going to, like, that's not going to come from you. That's going to come from elsewhere. That's going to be like an already existing ask, and you're like embedding that within your own language about why this matters. And then this is an action phone booth that Make Yourself Useful made, and we're sharing this just to talk about like creative and freaky ways to make doing this work a little bit more enticing and a little bit more communal. Leading up to the creation of the action phone booth, we were having a lot of conversations about how, like, okay, what are the barriers between us and like actually taking the time to make these phone calls? And we were like, you know, it's one conversation that we were having was like, you know, it's kind of like awkward. It's kind of embarrassing. It feels like you're just like speaking into the wind. Oftentimes you're like getting someone's voicemail. You have no idea if they're going to get it. And you're like, let me make sure that nobody's around me and nobody can hear me because this is like super awkward. And so we were talking about like, okay, we need an enclosed space where somebody can like kind of build themselves up and take sort of like a performative stance when they make their phone calls. And so we created the action phone booth, and we've brought it to different events that we've done and changed the script depending on the event. So this first one was back in August. We had a Families Belong Together fundraising weekend extravaganza that was all about the deplorable family separations that were and still are very much happening at the border. And so these were two different scripts, both of which came from organized communities against deportations. And we just modified them a little bit, which was something else just wanted to like mention once again, just not just because like previously I was talking about how it's useful to like get to the bottom of why you care and like try to create some unique language so that you're not like doing the boilerplate verbatim. But it's also a good idea to like spend a little time and look around and do your homework, because oftentimes like the asks change really quickly or the legislation will shift. So like, for example, in this one, we found this great script from OCAD, but we wanted to like add something about the Flores Agreement in there. So we just like took a few different sources and put them together and created a new script for the people who were coming to our fundraiser so they could go in the action phone booth and make calls. And then I think there's another slide about, yes. So this is just another example. This isn't an NYU action. This is something from a collective that I used to be part of, from something we did back in 2015. And this was part of a larger event, but it was a letter writing station particularly aimed at trying to get the Chicago City Council to pass legislation that would create reparations for survivors of police torture under former commander John Burge back in the 90s, who did a tremendous amount of harm. And this wasn't our campaign, but it was something that we were able to like communicate with the organizers about and make sure that there was like postcards and letter writing materials embedded in this like larger space that was in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so just adding this, you know, to say that like we all have the ability to create spaces like this, and it can be a really great way to like make this experience, which is which can feel like, you know, at best awkward, at worst, like kind of disempowering, because electoral politics, like what the fuck? And like, but we need to do it. Like we still need to engage. That's the point of this workshop. So these things can happen on a really small scale too. You know, you can do this, like you can have a socially distant porch hang and make a little letter writing station for everybody who comes to your hangout. And then this, I really liked this image. This is from the Sunrise website, like on their toolkit, where they show these like cozy friends doing their phone banking together. And I've done that a lot with friends, roommates, and it's like such a good way to get it done, because it can really feel like a chore. And so just whatever you can do to make your work a social experience is a really good way to like embed some sustainability and longevity and be cozy. And I think that's it for that slide.
So just to distill what Ruby was saying down, we're encouraging you and ourselves to think of this as a package deal. There's lots of calls, social media calls for us to be calling representatives in different places, which is awesome. And I hope that you all are doing it, and I'm sure that you are, but we're encouraging you and us to think of it as not just a one-step action, but part of a larger grouping of activities, like Ruby was saying. So if it's possible to show up in person, if there's some sort of protest to put pressure, consider doing that. If you can't do that, call. A pitfall I found myself falling into sometimes is like, well, there's so many people to call. If I just get a voicemail, I don't need to try calling back. But it's like, yeah, we need to call back. Even if we try 5 days in a row and we don't get them. This is not just like a one and done thing. Write a letter, as Ruby says, the weirder, the better. Craft an email. And then the most important thing is having an accountability buddy. A friend and I, we get on FaceTime on the computer and then talk through the issue if we've heard something else. And then we make the calls together. We talk about which ones are answering, which ones aren't. And it really helps to really schedule the time in the day and know that I'm taking out an hour of my time to do all of these different pieces.
So we've come to the part of the workshop where we're going to take some symbolic collective action together. And we were looking for a national campaign or call to plug into, because we wanted to use this opportunity not just to like do the action, but also to walk through the process of like looking up your representatives, calling them, etc. So this is about the House passage of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. It just passed in the House. And this is very much a police reform bill that we're, as a group, like we are not pro-police reform, we're pro-abolition, but it's still a really important bill. And it's been endorsed by family members of people who have died from police violence. And it does a lot of things that have already been done at the local level without that much success, but it's still a step in the right direction. And so we wanted to, let's go to the next slide, because there's actually some good criticism that we can just like, there's one previous to this slide. If you go back one. Oh yeah, thank you. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. So yeah, there's a lot of valid criticism. This is like an interview with a few different organizers in Minneapolis. I won't read all of it, but if you look at, so this is from one person, Ariana Nason. If you look at every single one of these points and then you just put it in quotes, do a Google search of a city with one of the House Democrat reforms. It will already show you all of the cities that have had these reforms in place already. And she goes on to say, unsuccessfully, oftentimes unsuccessfully. And we need, and then from somebody else, from Candace Montgomery and Miski Noor of the Black Visions Collective, they wrote for Vox earlier this month, we need to be funding more social workers, educators, and public health workers instead of funneling more money toward the police. So how can we use this bill? This was our question for tonight. How can we use what's going on with this bill as a way to think about, like, okay, electoral politics have to be engaged with, are extremely important. And symbolically, you know, this has been in some ways like a real kind of rallying groundswell moment for a lot of people in the House. And it's created a lot of like excitement within that structure. So how can we harness that excitement and try to like argue for a more like transformative or abolitionist measure and use this phone call to like practice that ethos? So the next slide. So we are going to, I'll put the links in the chat. So first we're going to find our Congress people using this link, the Common Cause link. Then we're going to find out if they voted yes or no. And that's at that link, the clerk.house.gov. And then we are going to call them, and it's after hours, so we'll leave a voicemail. And if they did vote yes, we're going to thank them and say, like, wow, thank you so much for voting to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. That's a really wonderful first step. And then proceed to these following plus sign points. And if they voted no, you can say, I'm extremely disappointed in you. However you want to say it. But again, it's a segue into these 2 points. First one is, I want to add that this bill does not go far enough to ensure public health and safety. Many of these measures have already been enacted at the local level, and have failed to keep Black and brown people from being harassed and murdered by police. We need to defund police and reimagine public safety. What legislation are you going to propose and promote to defund the police and support real investment in healthcare, education, and other social services? Leave your number, be like, call me back. I want to know. I asked you a question. And then it's also a good opportunity to plug HR 40, which is the bill that has been long sitting. It came up in 2019. It was proposed many times, and only in 2019 did it come up just like to even be looked at. I don't know the official term, but it has not been passed. It's a bill to study reparations, and it was introduced by former Michigan Representative John Conyers Jr. It kind of like gained notoriety in that Ta-Nehisi Coates Atlantic article, The Case for Reparations, that came out quite a few years ago, and it's still sitting. So it's been introduced, but it's pending. So this is an opportunity to also encourage your representatives to push for that. And I think we can, I'm not sure if other NYU folks have suggestions for how best to do this. I was thinking like maybe people are already looking up this information. We can go on mute. We can take like 3 minutes to make these calls, and then we can gather together again as a group and do some questions and answers and talk about how it went. If anybody had any like annoying experiences with voicemail, for example.
I just wanted to add one thing, which is that like this is like a really like creating your own scripts is that's a really good way to put to use a policy platform. Like and like read a thing and that can help you like inform a thing, which is helpful. So if you're like looking for something to say, you can go straight to the source.
Totally. Thank you.
So should we go to like the grid group?
Yeah. Actually,
And-
we'll want to have this slide up because it has our
Oh, right,
script.
right.
I can put it in the. I'll put it also in the chat.
And if you haven't put your congressman in your phone as a contact or congressperson, I encourage you to do so.
Oh, and at the bottom of this slide too, you can find out. Oh, for some reason I can't do that. You can find out if your congressperson has already co-sponsored HR 40, and you can say, thank you so much for co-sponsoring. Now, like, let's get it up for a vote. Let's push it. And if they haven't, you can ask them to co-sponsor.
Maybe folks can thumbs up when they're done. I think we might be there. So if folks have questions or want to share some wisdom, or maybe complain about how annoying it was to call your representative, open mic. Yeah, Thomas, mine was
Yeah.
too. That was a nice surprise. I didn't know that. Oh
Thanks,
yeah,
Alice.
go ahead, Kate.
Me? Oh, nothing.
Or is that you, Ruby?
Yeah, I was just
Oh,
saying thanks, Alice, for that resource. And then Greg, I'm gonna put this in the chat, which I tried to do earlier and it didn't work.
well, oh, here we go. So Jeremy says,
Oh.
I saw a Patriot Act episode that got me excited about ranked choice voting. Can anyone speak on that as a progressive pathway? Does anybody, I know what it is, but I don't really know much about it.
I've been like listening to and like reading about this a lot, but I don't know if I could like accurately speak to it other than to say that like I think that the people that I've heard talk about it, it feels like it's a very interesting idea, and I haven't heard, it's like I don't know if I can like speak to it totally or like where it is as a progressive pathway, but I'm certainly like I feel like I'm reading and listening and hearing about it a lot. So maybe I don't know if you have things that you might add or are thinking about with ranked choice voting. I've certainly heard people like discussing it, and it's I mean, something sort of feels like it has to change with the way that we vote, and that could be interesting. I also heard about a lot of like the kind of problems that maybe it would present for us to be because of the way that the system is currently working. But that's like all I know, which is a lot of words to say. I don't know, but I just.
I think one thing it brings up though is it's an exciting time in the sense that it feels like we are really, as a broader society, talking about our institutions and what works and what doesn't. And I do feel like the question about the tiered voting feels like really present this year, especially during the primaries. So, I mean, I'm sure there's like, that's probably a campaign you could get involved in, you know, is like pushing for that kind of system. Kelsey asks, is a scripted voicemail equivalent to a spammy email? Is it less effective to read a script than to quote freewheel?
I think to that
I,
point, oh, you go ahead, Kate.
no, go ahead.
I've heard from people who work in representatives' offices that they have to keep a tally of how many people are calling per issue. And so they'll put your message in that tally and pass it on. But if they feel like they've connected to you for some reason, like the story you've shared is really compelling to them, then they're more likely to actually pass on your individual message. So I think it's all useful, and definitely still worth doing. And I think that there's also ways we can get better at reading a script and sounding like we're not necessarily reading it, or like putting inflection, I think is really helpful. Like monotone reading definitely would be considered, you know, like no one's going to really listen to that. But if you can sort of modulate your voice a little bit, I think that's helpful. And that each call should be just one issue at a time. I don't think so. I think like they listen and they're like, oh, this is one tally for X and another one for this bill. That one is not corroborated, but that would be my hunch, is that it's okay to say many things in one call. Does anyone else know more definitively?
Well, I don't actually know more definitively. Just to piggyback on a thing before that, is just like in terms of you asked if it starts to feel normal and not terrible. And I think like just in terms of like, I think how many doors I've knocked on or like those kinds of things, like I feel like the answer is like yes, you kind of get practiced and you stop feeling uncomfortable and you're just like whatever. The other thing I was going to add to what Linnea had to say is that yeah, it definitely gets more comfortable. Is that one thing I also feel that happens to me occasionally is I get really angry and then I'm calling a representative and they have to maybe tally, but like, you know, it it is like not as effective to like kind of do like you want to like keep it in the level space. I've also heard that from people I know who like work for reps. Is that like you get a letter that just says like fuck you. Sorry, it's like that's a sorry we're swearing. But that is like you know like actually having a story that can be shared and giving like sort of constituents like you know being a constituent that people can yeah like reference and like use your anecdote is really really helpful.
I was going to just add that one of the things that I've had a really good experience with, which is really basic, but was just when a staffer answers, you just say, "Hi, how are you?" you just talk to them like they're somebody you know or like care about. And in a way, I mean, hopefully you do on some sort of abstract level. So it's nice to just like have a human start with a human interaction, and I think it makes it kind of like I think they listen more, and then also I just had a really good experiences just adding that simple stuff because nobody really taught me how to do this either. So I think when I first was doing it, I was just like, as soon as they would answer, I'd be like, and then I would just like launch into the script and like try to get it over with. But I think if you try to just set it up with a kind of like a human connection as much as you can, even though you got to keep it brief, it's helpful.
I will also say, and I haven't really worked out how I feel about this yet, but maybe it's useful to share with you all here, is that I would say 75% of the times when I call, I get so emotionally invested in what I'm sharing that I start crying, talking to the representative because it just feels super real. And I'm like, you're in a position where you can pass on this thing to someone who actually has some sort of power about this. And it's kind of embarrassing, but it's also like I'm a human being who's affected by this, and I'm having a genuine moment right now talking about this with you. And so yeah, that's I don't know exactly what to make of it, but I wanted to share it because I think all sorts of things get in the way of us doing this often as much as we need to. And so like, how do we keep figuring out how to do it even when things are uncomfortable with it?
Just wanted to note, Jeremy, there's a comment by Chris and Courtney in the chat that was in response to the couple of resources about, looks like podcasts about ranked choice voting. All right, maybe last call and we'll start to wrap it up.
Also, I think one thing to just add is like, if anybody is interested in like taking that sort of further step to get engaged with and start to support with your like labor and energy and stuff like community organizations and like grassroots organizing movement organizations, and I'm like around, and I feel like it's something that I think I just wanted to like offer up that there's like lots of there's lots of places to sort of like you know try things and get involved and be engaged, so like you can always find us too.
And it looks like the sharing settings were bad on the Google Doc script, so I'm resending it and hopefully that works.
Anna, that's great.
Oh, I also heard a friend posted recently on Instagram the I can't, it's the district attorney's like voicemail in what is Aurora, Colorado, where the police murdered Elijah. Sorry, I just forgot his last name.
McLean.
McLean, sorry, yeah. And that voicemail was essentially like, he was just like you could just like hear a city official being overwhelmed by calls, and like was expressing gratitude for that kind of like that movement, or that it really does actually like give them reason to act, when people make calls, when people like stand behind things. It's also really interesting. I've had a couple of opportunities to like lobby politicians, and it's like this, you give them a reason.
So Ruby posted the Workshops for White People Toolkit, the link there. And so there are some good resources for this work. And we, of course, will be updating and adding. We're recording the session tonight. We also will have the chat, and we'll get back to it as soon as we can, and start to update the toolkit. So just, check back there. We're also going to put the sessions and the links to the recordings in there, as well as I think all of our slideshows, TBD, but most stuff should be there. And then are we, NYU, ACRE, are we ready to close this out?
Sure. Do you want?
Oh, I just wanted to, sorry.
Good.
I just wanted to say we have one more workshop in this series. So next Tuesday is organizing your block to not call the cops. And there's definitely space available so if you go to our Instagram or our website, it's all through Eventbrite, and you can find those links there.
And as with every workshop, we are ending with commitments, our personal commitments of what we will do this week for racial justice and to stand and interrupt racism as it's occurring around us. So we'll start it off. NYU and ACRE will start it off. And if you're interested in being part of a text thread to be in touch with people and get support as you have conversations with coworkers or family members, and you need some support thinking about analysis or just emotional support, and you want more information about different resources, please put your number in the chat and we will create a thread. And we thank you so much. And yes, as Ruby said, next week here on Zoom, 8 p.m., we hope to see you.